Newly unsealed documents in Bryan Kohberger's case may be giving us a clue as to why prosecutors were eager to make a deal with the accused murderer. Kohberger's team planned to argue a major piece of evidence was planted. Could it have created reasonable doubt? We'll discuss. I'm Angenette Levy, and this is Crime Fix. Being online is just part of life, but seeing how much personal information is on the web about you can be really scary. That's why I like Incogni so much. The company can actually help you protect your personal information. Things like your name, your phone number, address, and other info so scammers and data brokers can't get it and sell it. You can sign up on Incogni's website and they'll start removing your data ASAP. Setup takes just minutes. Just create an account, authorize Incogni to act for you, and they do the rest. And with the company's new Unlimited Plans custom removals feature, you can submit custom links where your data shows up, and a privacy expert will remove it just for you. So if you care about your online safety, and you really should, take your data back with Incogni. Use code CRIMEFIX for 60% off an annual plan. When Bryan Kohberger's case was moving toward trial, we got some hints about where his defense was going to go, but honestly, they didn't have a lot of options except for attacking the state's evidence. Judge Hibbler ruled weeks before jury selection was set to begin that Kohberger couldn't accuse friends of the victims of the murders, so he didn't have many options and he didn't have an alibi that the judge was going to allow him to present. Despite Kohberger's guilty plea, he has supporters online who still believe that he's innocent and that he pleaded guilty only because he faced the possibility of the death penalty if he were convicted at trial. We're learning now from newly unsealed documents that Bryan Kohberger was definitely going to claim that evidence was planted, specifically that K-bar knife sheath that police said was found next to victim Maddie Mogen's leg. In July of 2025, Bryan Kohberger agreed to plead guilty to breaking into the house on King Road and stabbing to death Maddie Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle in the early morning hours of November 13, 2022. The murders were horrific. Most of the students were stabbed in their sleep, except for Xana, and it's possible, reading the new reports, that Kaylee and Ethan may have awakened during the attack. The attacks on the students were heinous, absolutely heinous. Autopsy reports show that Kaylee suffered more than 24 wounds to her face, and she was stabbed in the chest, her blood alcohol concentration just above the legal limit, 0.107. Prosecutors have said that Maddie couldn't possibly fight back because of her intoxication level. Her blood alcohol concentration was 0.282. She suffered 13 stab wounds to the face, scalp, and neck, along with wounds to her lungs and liver. I've told you before that Xana fought for her life, and her autopsy revealed that she suffered 23 stab wounds to the face, neck, and scalp, and 25 wounds to her upper extremities, meaning her arms, along with other fatal wounds to the heart and jugular vein. Her blood alcohol concentration was 0.229, and she had amphetamine in her system. Xana's boyfriend, Ethan, also had amphetamine in his system. His blood alcohol level was 0.122. He also suffered stab wounds to his head and scalp, and one to his upper chest, and several on his legs. Ethan also suffered a fatal wound to the jugular vein. Now, I share this information with you so you can understand what this jury was going to hear from prosecutors at trial and what Kohberger's defense was going to present. It may have turned into a battle of the experts. The defense was going to call expert Dr. Brent Turvey to offer his expert opinion on a number of things related to the crime scene. And given my coverage of this case, some of his opinions are kind of surprising to me, while others are not, given what we know about the defense's claims. First up, Dr. Turvey was going to testify that the bodies of Maddie and Kaylee were posed, since he said that Kaylee's body appeared to have moved, and so did Maddie's left leg. But the state planned to call Paulette Sutton, an expert, to rebut Turvey's testimony. Sutton planned to testify that posing would be an intentional act and possible, but it wouldn't be the only explanation for why their bodies could have moved. Now, one thing Kohberger's defense repeatedly pointed to was a lack of blood found in his white Hyundai Elantra and his apartment. CSIs took apart that white Elantra and didn't find one speck of blood belonging to the victims in that vehicle. The prosecution said Kohberger's background in criminology equipped him with the know-how to keep from contaminating a crime scene and how to clean up afterward. Paulette Sutton planned to testify. The significance of the lack of secondary transfer in a vehicle purportedly used when leaving the scene must take into consideration what is applicable to the particular scene in question. One must consider first that there was a limited amount of secondary transfer within the scene itself, which is attributable to someone other than Mogen, Goncalves, Kernodle, or Chapin. An assailant can easily remove protective clothing and shoe covers or place unstained coverings over stained clothing or shoes before they contact their vehicle or residence. Cleaning or wiping off excess blood before making contact with secondary surfaces is also possible. Now, it's terrible to talk about, but there was blood from Kaylee and Maddie found dripped around the house, and Ethan too. This photo shows the handrail going from the 3rd floor where Kaylee and Maddie's bedrooms were located to the 2nd floor. The report says that there were blood transfer stains on the handrail, and they tested positive for Maddie's DNA. There are other blood stains going down those stairs and on the wall. They are marked stain K and stain J in the reports. In the living room on the half wall, above the stairs leading to the front door, the report says that there is a transfer stain of blood belonging to Ethan Chapin. The report notes there's no evidence that Ethan was ever out of Xana's bedroom after he was stabbed. On the same half wall near the beer pong table, the report says there are cast-off bloodstains, with Kaylee being the major DNA contributor and Maddie being a minor contributor. Cast-off, the report notes, happens when blood is released from a bloody object being in motion. Kohberger's lawyers plan to call Dr. Turvey to testify that there was no way that one person could have carried out the murders in such a short span of time, about 12 minutes. Dr. Turvey said 2 assailants likely carried out these murders. Dr. Turvey wrote, "It is not reasonable to think that Ethan would have remained in his bed after waking up or being awake while Xana was being attacked in front of him. This evidence and context begin to suggest the existence of a second attacker." Turvey continued, "At least 2 suspects were involved in this attack. This is indicated by the fact that multiple weapons were used against Kaylee, that multiple types of lethal force were used against Kaylee, and that Ethan and Xana appear to have been attacked at the same time. This is inconsistent with the state's theory that these crimes were committed solely by one individual." Paulette Sutton commented in response, "There is evidence that Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle were in close proximity to each other at some point after the assault began, as evidenced by the finding of Kernodle's blood and DNA under the fingernails of Ethan Chapin's right hand, and the finding of Chapin's blood and DNA under the fingernails of both Xana Kernodle's hands. One assailant could contain 2 people in close proximity to each other, especially if the assailant is armed. A single perpetrator can certainly use more than one weapon and can use multiple types of lethal force." Now to the knife sheath, the major piece of evidence that connected Bryan Kohberger with his DNA on the leather strap to the crime scene. That sheath was found partially under Maddie Mogen's leg and her comforter. Well, Dr. Turvey was going to testify for the defense that the sheath, in his opinion, was planted. Turvey reports that the knife sheath was staged for the following reasons. Crime scene staging refers to an attempt to confuse or misdirect a law enforcement investigation by altering, fabricating, or planting evidence in relation to a crime scene. In the present case, a K-bar knife sheath was discovered in the crime scene by law enforcement. Evidence of staging with respect to this item of evidence is as follows. The sheath was found precariously placed just slightly under the body of Madison Mogen and partially covered by the comforter that was placed atop the midsection of her body by the suspects. It could not have fallen accidentally into this location. The state had Paulette Sutton ready to testify to the contrary. The sheath could have become trapped under Madison Mogen's body when she moved her left leg out of the bed. If she were hurriedly moving her left leg, she would not have taken time to move the comforter, in which case the sheath would be trapped between the comforter and the bed. So to really dig into this idea of staging of the sheath at the crime scene that Dr. Brent Turvey was going to testify to had there been a trial. I want to bring in Dr. Laura Petler. She is a criminologist and actually studied Brent Turvey's work. Dr. Petler, I'm so excited to have you on. Thank you for coming on. Your thoughts on this first point that Dr. Turvey brought up, that an attempt to stage something is an attempt to misdirect a law enforcement investigation. It almost feels like Dr. Turvey wasn't going to accuse the cops of staging the scene or planting the sheath, but maybe saying that somebody else did.
Hi, Angenette. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm happy to be here. Yes, so I have read over Brent Turvey's work over the years, and I understand his definitions of staging, and I understand the premise that was contained in the documents. And I agree that staging is an attempt to purposefully manipulate the evidence, or it could be any kind of evidence, really, to misdirect a death investigation or a law enforcement investigation. And I also understand that he wasn't trying to accuse the cops, but potentially maybe accusing somebody else of planting that sheath. And for me, the first thing that I thought was interesting is, in order to have an element of staging, there's typically a victim-offender relationship. And one of the things I think is important to point out is they haven't been able to establish a victim-offender relationship between Mr. Kohberger and the victims in this case. So that was the very first thing that I wanted to mention in regards to staging, because it's typically a victim-offender relationship type function.
Yeah, and there was no relationship ever established between Bryan Kohberger and any of these victims. The cops looked and they couldn't find any connection. They as much said that after the sentencing for this case. One of the things that was really interesting to me, and I don't know how they would have gotten past this, was the fact that Bryan Kohberger's DNA was on the leather strap of that sheath. It was single source, male DNA. It was his DNA. I don't know how they would have gotten over that hurdle, though. So, I don't know if they would have said, I don't know if the defense would have said somebody stole his sheath out of his car. Yeah, he owned it because he bought it on Amazon. I don't know. What do you think they would have done, or do you have an opinion on that?
I'm not a DNA expert, and so I don't want to overreach and render any kind of a DNA opinion, but it would be hard, in my opinion, just as a forensic criminologist, to plant somebody's DNA on a sheath that belonged to another person, because that would mean that you would have to collect it from that other person and then not contaminate it, and then not contaminate it not only with other people but yourself as included, and then put it on the sheath, and then make sure that's transferred, physically moved into the scene without being contaminated. So there would be a lot of issues like that for me to present something like that in court. How would you manage to do that? And I'm sure there's other elements of touch DNA, which I think is widely misunderstood. In general, I think there's a lot of things that maybe people think about DNA that we always have to rely on the experts for, to render their own opinions about DNA as it actually can be transferred. So I don't think that would have stuck.
Yeah, I know I interviewed a DNA expert about a year and a half ago who literally said, single source DNA, it would be incredibly difficult to do that. I want to go on to this second point that Dr. Turvey made. And he was saying basically he felt this sheath was staged, according to these documents, because it was new and unused and it didn't have wear and tear on the leather. And then Paulette Sutton, the state's expert, she was going to testify to rebut that. And she would have said that she doesn't know why that would have proved that staging occurred. She said it could easily mean that the knife was subjected to only light use in the past, or that it was purchased just for those homicides. So what do you make of those two competing arguments?
I think that Paulette is an extremely thorough expert. I've had the honor of working with her and learning from her for the past maybe 20 years or so now. She was one of my very first instructors, so I actually know Paulette, and I know her work and as far as like blood stain pattern analysis and crime scene reconstruction. So I know that her opinions are grounded in physical evidence, and they are grounded in what's observable, and they are never inflated, and they always can tie back to something that makes sense. And so for her to render an opinion like something so simple as, well, maybe it was new and it wasn't used very much, I mean, that's what she can observe in the scene, in the evidence, and she's going to directly substantiate her opinion based on something that you can actually tie it back to.
Now, their next argument, or at least Brent Turvey's next argument, was, well, the reason this was staged, in his opinion, this is battle of the experts type stuff, you know. So this is what this would have turned into, and this may have been like, you know, the OJ bloody glove. I don't know. I mean, who knows what this would have turned into at trial? And this is why I think maybe the prosecutors were like, yeah, let's do a deal. And we're so quick to do this because maybe they were really afraid of this. You know, Dr. Turvey felt that the sheath was staged because it was face down. It had only received a few areas of minute blood spatter, either impact or aspirated, just horrific, while resting atop a sheet with significant impact spatter all around. The inconsistency of blood spatter, he said, dispersion and density indicates transfers occurring at different times under different conditions with different levels of intensity. And then Paulette Sutton said the difference in the amount of spatter on the sheath versus the amount on the fitted sheet or even the comforter simply proves the sheath came to rest in this location where it was discovered at a different time during the spatter producing events. It does not prove that it was staged in this location. The sheath could have been at another location when it was spattered and then moved here at a later time. If the perpetrator moved the comforter, as Dr. Turvey believes, the sheath could have been moved to this location when the comforter was moved. This could account for a different amount of spatter on the exposed surface of the sheath and the exposed surface of the bed sheet. So again, two different, you know, narratives there.
Right. Yeah, you know, I think that you have a physical struggle going on. It's a very high stress situation. And I think that the offender in this particular case prioritized getting out rather than recovery of the sheath. And for me, the sheath and the placement and all of that is a function of accidental loss as opposed to staging at any level.
Interesting. You know, the theory, it appears, is that Xana, and this is what we know from the witness testimony, that Xana, one of the victims here, heard what was going on, ran up the stairs, and may have interrupted something, and then the sheath was left by mistake. So that could be a big part of this as well. Apparently, there was evidence of her climbing the stairs and then descending the stairs. And there was going to be witness testimony to that effect as well. Now, the fourth reason that Dr. Turvey believes that this sheath was planted was that he says that the sheath was placed at the location without receiving bloody transfer from the hands or fingers of the suspect that did it. This means it was done after the attack/posing, but also after the suspect had washed their hands subsequent to cleanup efforts. Paulette Sutton says, no, it is true that there are no bloody transfers visible on the knife sheath, but the significance of this finding does not support that this placement of the sheath was staged. It could have gotten in this location without having been touched by a perpetrator, or even after their hands were cleaned or gloves removed. Either scenario would explain the lack of contact staining without staging having occurred. I mean, couldn't it have just been placed on the bed?
Yes.
Placed down before any of the attacking happened?
Yes.
I mean, that's how I always envisioned this happening. It was placed down, and the attacker was surprised.
That is exactly, I agree with you 100%. To me, when I envision this, I envision the offender coming in, removing the knife from the sheath, placing it down at some point you know, in any particular location. And I don't know the scene that well to be able to speak to it more than that exactly, but then never touching it again, because again, there is a physical struggle going on. It is an extremely high stress situation. You've got one person with a knife and two people that are trying to survive. So you have this divergent roles, you know, very different roles in the scene. You have two people that are trying to live. You have one person who is trying to kill. So they're very different. And, you know, I don't think that the focus is on the sheath. Where's the sheath? Where's the sheath? Where's the sheath? I don't think that was ever part of the thinking, because a lot of times offenders get into what I call cognitive overload, like where they're just sort of overwhelmed by the circumstances of what's going on. And, you know, maybe he, again, tried to prioritize his exit as opposed to recovering that sheath, or he didn't even know where it went. He had no idea. It could have been under something and it was dark and he couldn't see it.
That my feeling has always been, in just looking at this crime scene and trying to piece together or recreate in my mind what could have happened, was that you know, the perpetrator goes up to the third floor. He's in Maddie's room, anticipates Maddie and not two girls in the bed, and then is surprised by a second girl, and then potentially Xana the third arriving on the third floor. That creates chaos. It did not go according to plan. That is simply my opinion.
And I agree with you 100%, and that's always been my opinion as well. And I haven't done a lot of work on this case, Angenette, but I did, when it first happened, I looked at it a bit, and that was my opinion from the beginning. Exactly what you just said, was that there was a particular target, and he wasn't counting on two people being there at the same time. So then he had two people instead of one person to deal with, and that the other two people heard this. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that there's evidence that Xana went up the stairs and then came down the stairs. I did not know that. So I think that's also very interesting. And that's, I agree with you completely. That is exactly what I thought too from the very beginning, that it was one person that was targeted.
And I don't think that the prosecutors even believe that the perpetrator went in there looking to kill four people.
No.
They've as much said that in court.
No.
So I want to move on now to this whole idea that Dr. Turvey said that there had to be two people that committed these crimes. Mm-hmm. It was not one person. There's just no way. And Paulette Sutton's like, no, it could have been one person. You know, earlier in the show, I read the autopsy results and talked about the blood alcohol content, particularly of Maddie, and of all the kids, actually, all the victims here. They were really intoxicated. They'd been out to parties and to bars and to a football game. So you've got one person all jacked up on adrenaline attacking people in their sleep. So what is your opinion on that? Of course it could have been two people, but do you believe it also could have been one?
You know, it's always important to recognize that you have to consider alternatives when you're looking at any particular homicide, and the failure to look at alternatives kind of gets people into a tunnel vision situation, which is never good. It's very myopic, so we really want to keep it broad. But in this particular case, it's important to recognize that the offender had the advantage of a weapon. You know, he is the only person holding a weapon. He has the element of surprise. He also has the victims isolated. And like you're saying, everyone's intoxicated after coming home from a night of fun with friends. And so he has a complete advantage in multiple ways over every situation in this particular case. And I don't think that there is evidence to support multiple offenders. A lot of times when we have multiple offenders, you'll see kind of like a divergent wound pattern. You'll see they take on different roles. The sequence is different. They coordinate, and they kind of will come in as like a tag team. Okay, like you're going to do this and I'm going to do this, you know, and I don't see any evidence of that. You see multiple footwear impressions or other types of evidence of two people in there, and I don't think we see that in this case.
I think this would have been a really interesting trial, but as we know, it only takes one juror to hang a jury. And in reading all of this, it makes me wonder, with the attention that this case got, whether, the prosecutors wanted to make a deal because they were concerned that maybe Dr. Turvey would be convincing.
My experience in the DA's office as an investigator there and watching prosecutors prosecute homicide cases, they do make decisions based on the quality, the quantity of the evidence, and maybe try to mitigate what could happen in trial. And as you mentioned, maybe the prosecutors were concerned about a conviction in this case because there were things that they felt could hang up the jury, and maybe there could be one juror, that didn't agree, and it would result in a mistrial or some other catastrophe for the families. And I think they were all trying to avoid any more pain to these families.
It is interesting. It's just a horrific case. Dr. Laura Pettler, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. I hope you'll come back sometime.
Thank you so much for having me, Angenette.
And one last thing. There's been a lot of discussion in this case about two unknown male profiles found at the King Road house, one on a handrail inside and one on a glove outside of the house. DNA analysts for the state plan to testify that those samples were not put into CODIS because of their location in the crime scene. Those samples were not considered probative, and the analysts were going to testify that is why they were not put into the combined DNA index system for identification. And that's it for this episode of Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. Thanks so much for being with me. I'll see you back here next time.